Hello, I'm Dawn McCoy, and I've been a leader in the public sector for more than 2 decades. It seems like just yesterday, 2020 was a tumultuous year. It was frustrating and overwhelming. People were sad, and there were depictions of protests amidst racial injustice. Police brutality was televised, and people were anxious. I could feel all of this tension watching television programs, and I myself had to turn off television and filter social media. You see, there were calls for police reform and action. But it more importantly reminded me on a personal level of my own challenges experienced in 2002 as the youngest African American elected to the Sacramento City School Board. On the first few board meetings, there were more than 1,000 people in a high school auditorium to protest and speak out about a high school closure announced by the school superintendent. It was challenging and overwhelming. I didn't understand why the people were protesting. They were angry and they were bringing comments. It led me to ask a fundamental question. Why do people protest? I wanted to understand the fear and frustration that I had experienced on a personal level, but I saw televised in 2020 with the pandemic and the racial epidemic taking place nationwide. I had to ask questions about what are the reasons why people protest? They're trying to influence a policy or a proposal. They're looking to oppose something, to take some action, and more importantly, to initiate a desired outcome. I had to look into what did that mean. A Pew Research Center study in 2019 concluded that 66% of survey respondents concluded that they were dissatisfied and did not trust their elected leaders at the federal level. It was disheartening, but it also led me to ask a fundamental question. What can each of us do to get involved and do something? Today, I'd like to talk about my experiences inside of governance, but also to pull back the curtain about these experiences, to influence you who are thinking about public service careers, those of you who are thinking about how you might be a civil servant, to think about also civic engagement opportunities, to get involved and do something. I have to go back in time and look because the United States has a history of protests. Quite frankly, it's not the first time. In fact, 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote the book, Why We Can't Wait. It was a culmination of the experiences leading up to 1963 and talking about, not only was it the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in 1954 passed and calling for desegregation of schools in the United States, but right after that, states decided to push back with massive resistance legislation, not cooperating with the legislation, the rule that was put in place by the Supreme Court. And also you have to remember Rosa Parks, who took a seat on a bus in the white section where she was not supposed to be. She was taking her rights into her own hands. Dr. Martin Luther King was talking about why people had to wait, and the waiting was becoming unbearable for many. In 1963, Dr. King led the March on Washington, and it was effective in bringing about change. It was not immediate change. In fact, it took about a year or two for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to be implemented. Likewise, A. Philip Randolph led a march that was going to happen in 1941, but he forced the hand of then President Franklin Roosevelt to sign an executive order to dismantle and do away with discrimination in the defense industry. It's pivotal because it makes me think about, do protests even work? The Atlantic had an article in June of 2020 that said, yes, they do work, and sometimes it can take decades. And I believe that is in fact true. It is all about how we look at getting involved and doing something, making a difference in our communities, and making sure that those who are involved do that. Let me just take a little moment and talk about on the federal level, how policy and process gets done. The Iron Triangle is a process known about how interest groups work collectively with Congress and talk about bringing things into legislative measures in committee and work collectively with agencies to implement these policies. And there it goes around, the inside and outside forces working together to bring about change. It's a policy process that takes place, but it is also about us asking a fundamental question. Not just are we looking at the processes that are in place, but are we waiting for another great leader? Are we waiting for another Dr. King or someone else to lead us? No, we cannot. In fact, I submit that it is about all of our collective experiences, about being proactive. Let me take you on a short walk. My journey, 1988. I'm a college student at Howard University in Washington, D.C. It had just been the period of the 1980s with affirmative action legislation and discussions. Women's rights movements were taking place, and there were discussions and protests and activities about South African apartheid ending and calling for the freedom of Nelson Mandela. George Bush was elected in 1989, and amidst the 20-year stint of the 1963 March on Washington, 1983 celebration, there was a lot going on. I said, what can I do to get involved? I said, do I have the qualifications? And in fact, what can I do to make a difference? I had to question myself and get over my self-doubt and my insecurity that I could actually make a difference. So what I asked myself was that fundamental question again: how could I get involved and do something? I had to look at what could be available to me, and I thought about, wow, it would be great to go work for my hometown congressman. So I took myself on up to Capitol Hill to his Washington, D.C. office and asked if I could work for him to have an internship. Thankfully, unfortunately, he hired me on as a congressional aide. Let me tell you, those positions are not paid. Some of the unpaid congressional internships are the best ones, learning and cutting your teeth on how government works. I was fortunate to have that unpaid position that I loved and cherished, because I not only got to write constituent letters, to be able to be in the halls of Congress and sit in on interest group meetings where they were talking with congressional staff about what to do and how to make decisions, but I got to understand governance. And let me tell you, Norm Mineta, a real trailblazer in civil rights. He, in fact, was a Japanese American interned during World War II. He was pulled from his home in California in his Boy Scout uniform to go to Wyoming for several years. I wanted to work for someone who worked his way up through being mayor of San Jose and eventually, obviously, a congressman and serving in 2 different administrations. He was all about what I believed in: civil rights and equity for people. He hired me on after that stint as a congressional intern, I must say. It was a great turn. And he influenced my decision to run for office in 2002 when I took my seat as an elected school board member. On that governing board, 7 of us making decisions. As I mentioned, several outrageous board meetings where people came and registered their opinions. They were mad, angry. They were truly frustrated with a school closure with no public input. I too was disillusioned. How were we making a decision to close a school without having any public input? And in fact, the Sacramento Bee and other newspapers and periodicals captured the action of me asking lots of questions about why we were making decisions as a governing board without a true policy process in place. And in fact, before I left office on my own and did not seek re-election in 2006, I said, you know what, let's make sure we've got some policies on the books to make sure to have a proper constituent listening process. And we did just that. But it was about me getting involved in the governance process as a member of the governing board. But more importantly, I submit that we have to think about governance, all of us. We have governance all around us. It's the traffic lights in our town, city council and the mayor making those decisions to traffic regulate, to change and benchmark lighting and adding new things. They're the ones who are making the decisions and implementing what's happening at the governing board level. Governance is all around us, but it's more important that we talk about good governance. If you go back to those periods of civil rights and protests, it wasn't just about implementing Brown Board of Education. It wasn't just about implementing Voting Rights Acts, but it was also about making sure we have good governance, equitable and accessible for everyone. Good governance means, according to Governance Today, is about fairness and accountability and transparency. It's about what can we do to have better and effective rules at what we do. Fortunately, after I left Capitol Hill, I got to work in the nonprofit industry for several decades. Wonderful opportunity to serve and lead, and to be able to take what I learned to get involved and do something in the education and special education world. It's been an opportunity, I say, for you as well to get involved. One, how can you do that? By making sure you volunteer. Think about using your talents and skills to be effective in helping others. What can you do to be a resource in your community? In fact, how can you take what you have, your know-how, to work at a nonprofit or to help out at a community group or to make sure you're doing something in some other local way? I know both while I was a board member and after, I took pen to paper. Some of the people know me, I like to write and I like to read. So it was being able to help others understand the nuances of policies and also to have me help put pen to paper and help make sure to articulate those ideas as a volunteer. A second way to get involved civically is to make sure for those who are thinking about public service careers to get involved specifically through service learning. Service learning opportunities are where you learn what's in the classroom through teachable experiences and being able to learn and listen to how governance is, and then to go out and have that practical experience, i.e. an internship, a practicum, other types of experiences. It's a great on-the-job learning opportunity where students can get college credit and also others can get really involved. A third way is to make sure to attend local board meetings, regional efforts, and others to not only be there to register your opposition. You don't like that new traffic light? Be able to know what the process is to register your opposition and to speak out about it. And more importantly, like the people I've talked about, yes, protesting, yes, being angry, yes, having input, but being able to make sure they're making a true difference in doing that. I'm glad and fortunate that I've had a variety of experiences that have led to the culmination of continuing to influence and lead others. It's not only about us being in positions of power, governance, authority, but also being there to bring about equity and access so that we listen to those who have concerns, who might be outraged and fearful or frustrated, that we take those level of protests and lead to more governance that's effective, good governance. Rosa Parks once said, to bring about change, you must not be afraid to take the first steps. We will fail when we fail to try. So will you join me and get involved and do something?